During World War II, one of history's most destructive conflicts unfolded not just on battlefields but in the skies above Europe. Two allies, the United States and Great Britain, joined forces to bomb Nazi Germany into submission, but they did so in remarkably different ways. The Americans flew during daylight hours, while the British operated under cover of darkness. This wasn't a random choice or simple preference. It was the result of different philosophies, different experiences, different aircraft, and different lessons learned through blood and fire. To understand why this happened, we need to go back to the beginning of the war and trace how each nation arrived at its bombing strategy. The story involves technological innovation, strategic thinking, devastating losses, and ultimately a combined effort that helped bring Nazi Germany to its knees. When World War II began in September 1939, Britain's Royal Air Force believed, like most air forces of the time, that bombers could strike precisely at military and industrial targets during daylight. The theory was simple. Fly over enemy territory during the day when you can see your target, drop your bombs on factories and military installations, and return home. This was called precision bombing, and it seemed like a civilized, efficient way to wage war, hitting the enemy's ability to fight while avoiding unnecessary civilian casualties. Reality proved brutally different. In the early months of the war, the RAF sent bombers over Germany in daylight raids. The results were catastrophic. German fighter planes like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 tore through the bomber formations. Anti-aircraft guns, able to see the bombers clearly against the daytime sky, shot them down in alarming numbers. The bombers of that era, aircraft like the Armstrong Whitworth Whitley, the Hanley Page Hampton, and the Vickers Wellington, were simply too slow, too poorly armed, and too vulnerable to survive daylight operations against a determined enemy with strong defenses. The losses mounted quickly. Crews didn't return. Young men who had breakfast in England never made it back for dinner. The RAF faced a terrible choice: continue daylight bombing and lose unsustainable numbers of aircraft and trained crews, or adapt. They chose to adapt. By 1940, the RAF had largely shifted to night bombing. Flying at night offered obvious advantages. German fighters couldn't easily find bombers in the darkness. Anti-aircraft gunners couldn't aim accurately at what they couldn't see. Bombers could approach their targets with a much better chance of survival. But night bombing came with its own enormous problems. You couldn't see what you were bombing. In the early 1940s, navigation technology was primitive by modern standards. Bombers relied on basic instruments, maps, visual landmarks, and dead reckoning, essentially educated guessing based on speed, direction, and time. On a clear day, this worked reasonably well. At night, over blacked-out enemy territory, with clouds, darkness, and sometimes deliberate German deception, like fake cities with lights to draw bombers away from real targets, it became nearly impossible to find specific targets. A shocking study conducted in 1941, known as the Butt Report, analyzed photographs taken by RAF bombers during their raids. The results were devastating to British confidence. The report found that only about 1 in 3 aircraft actually got within 5 miles of their intended target. In some cases, particularly when attacking targets in the heavily defended Ruhr Valley, only 1 in 10 bombers came anywhere near their objective. Many bombs fell in empty fields. Some fell in the wrong cities entirely. This created a serious problem for British military planners. Night bombing was necessary for survival, but it wasn't achieving its objectives. The RAF couldn't hit specific factories or military installations with any reliability. The British response was to change their strategy entirely. If they couldn't hit specific buildings, they would hit entire cities. Area bombing, a controversial decision. Under the leadership of Air Marshal Arthur Harris, who took command of RAF Bomber Command in February 1942, the British adopted a policy that became known as area bombing or carpet bombing. The official term was often less blunt, but the reality was clear. Instead of aiming at a specific factory, RAF bombers would target entire industrial cities. The logic went like this: German war production depended on workers. Workers needed homes, transportation, food, water, and services. If you destroyed the cities where workers lived, you destroyed their morale, killed the workforce, disrupted transportation and utilities, and indirectly crippled the factories even if you didn't hit them directly. Additionally, massive raids on cities would tie down German resources, anti-aircraft guns, fighters, civil defense workers, and reconstruction crews that could otherwise be used on the battlefronts. This strategy was brutal and controversial even at the time. It meant deliberately bombing residential areas where civilians lived. The British government and RAF maintained that they were targeting industrial areas and that civilian casualties were an unavoidable consequence of attacking legitimate military-industrial targets. Critics, both then and now, have argued that area bombing was indiscriminate and amounted to terrorism against civilian populations. Regardless of the moral arguments, the British pursued this strategy with increasing intensity. They developed new technologies and tactics specifically for night bombing. The RAF created the Pathfinder Force, elite squadrons that would fly ahead of the main bomber stream, locate the target city, and mark it with incendiary bombs and colored flares. The following waves of bombers would then aim at these markers, creating a concentration of destruction. British bombers evolved to carry this out. The Avro Lancaster, which became the iconic British heavy bomber, could carry enormous bomb loads, up to 22,000 pounds, including massive blockbuster bombs designed to blow off roofs and expose buildings, followed by incendiaries to set the exposed structures ablaze. The RAF refined its tactics through terrible experiences. They learned to create firestorms, massive conflagrations that generated their own weather systems, with winds rushing inward to feed the flames, creating infernos that could destroy entire sections of cities. The most infamous example was the raid on Hamburg in July 1943, Operation Gomorrah, which killed an estimated 42,000 people and left hundreds of thousands homeless. Similar devastation was inflicted on Dresden in February 1945, though that raid involved both British and American bombers. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, the U.S. Army Air Forces brought a fundamentally different philosophy to strategic bombing. Unlike the British, who had learned through bitter experience that daylight bombing was suicidal, the Americans believed they could make it work. This confidence stemmed from several factors. First, the Americans had developed what they believed was a superior bomber, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. This aircraft was specifically designed for high-altitude, daylight precision bombing. It was heavily armed with up to 13.50 caliber machine guns, giving it defensive firepower that earlier bombers lacked. It could fly at altitudes around 25,000 to 30,000 feet, where it was harder for enemy fighters to reach and where the thinner air made anti-aircraft fire less effective. It had excellent range and could carry substantial bomb loads deep into German territory. Later, the Americans added the consolidated B-24 Liberator, which could carry even more bombs and had even greater range, though it was somewhat less rugged than the B-17. Second, the Americans had developed the Norden bombsight, a sophisticated mechanical computer that could calculate the trajectory needed to hit a target from high altitude, accounting for altitude, airspeed, wind, and other factors. American military planners believed this device would allow them to hit targets with unprecedented accuracy. They talked about putting a bomb in a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. Third, American strategic bombing doctrine emphasized precision. The U.S. Army Air Forces wanted to prove that air power could win wars by destroying an enemy's ability to fight, their factories, refineries, transportation networks, and military installations, without resorting to the widespread destruction of cities. This approach was seen as more efficient, more humane, and more in line with American values. It was also seen as more likely to generate public support back home. The American plan was to fly in large formations during daylight, use their mass defensive firepower to fight off enemy fighters, and use their bomb sights to strike specific, vital targets with precision. They believed that by systematically destroying Germany's industrial capacity, particularly its ball bearing plants, aircraft factories, and oil refineries, they could cripple the German war machine without needing to burn entire cities. The British were skeptical. They had tried daylight bombing and knew the cost. But the Americans were confident, and they were determined to try. The first American bombing raid on German-occupied Europe took place on August 17, 1942, when 12 B-17s attacked railroad yards at Rouen in France. It was a small-scale operation, relatively close to Britain, and met light resistance. It seemed to validate American tactics. But as the Americans penetrated deeper into German territory and attacked more heavily defended targets, the situation changed dramatically. German defenses were formidable. The Luftwaffe had excellent fighters, not just the Bf-109 but also the Focke-Wulf Fw-190, a rugged, heavily armed fighter that could tear through bomber formations. German pilots developed tactics specifically to counter American formations. They would attack head-on, where the bombers had fewer defensive guns, or concentrate overwhelming firepower on individual bombers to knock them out of formation, then pick off the stragglers. German anti-aircraft artillery, known as flak, created fields of exploding shrapnel that bombers had to fly through. At high altitude, the flak created black clouds of explosions that crews called flak fields. Flying through one was like running through a minefield, pure chance whether you survived or got hit. A single piece of shrapnel could kill a crewman, damage an engine, rupture fuel tanks, or shred control surfaces. The Americans suffered terrible losses. Missions deep into Germany might see 10, 15, or even 20% of bombers failing to return. Missions were considered particularly brutal if losses exceeded 5%, because at that rate, a crew completing the required 25 missions had very low odds of survival. Two raids in particular highlighted the challenges of daylight bombing. The first was the August 17, 1943, raid on the ball bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt fighter assembly plants at Regensburg, the anniversary of that first American raid a year earlier. This was a maximum effort involving 376 bombers flying deep into Germany without fighter escort. American fighters of the time lacked the range to accompany bombers all the way to the target and back. The bombing caused significant damage, but 60 bombers were lost, 16% of the force. Many more returned so badly damaged they never flew again. The second Schweinfurt raid on October 14, 1943, was even worse. Of 291 B-17s that set out, 60 were shot down and another 17 were so badly damaged they were scrapped. More than 26% losses. Another 121 returned with battle damage. Of the roughly 2,900 airmen who flew that mission, about 650 were killed or captured. The day became known as Black Thursday. After Black Thursday, the 8th Air Force temporarily stopped unescorted deep penetration raids. The losses were simply unsustainable. Crews had to be replaced, aircraft had to be rebuilt, and tactics had to be reconsidered. Some voices argued that the Americans should abandon daylight bombing and join the British night offensive. But the Americans didn't give up on daylight bombing. Instead, they solved the problem that had made it so deadly. They developed long-range fighter escorts. The game changer, long-range fighters. The key to making daylight bombing work was protecting the bombers all the way to the target and back. What the Americans needed was a fighter with the range to accompany bombers deep into Germany, the altitude performance to operate where the bombers flew, and the combat capability to defeat German fighters. They found it in the North American P-51 Mustang. The P-51 Mustang is often called one of the finest fighter aircraft of World War II, and for good reason. With external drop tanks, disposable fuel tanks that could be jettisoned when empty or when entering combat, the Mustang had the range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Could match or exceed the performance of German fighters. It was fast, maneuverable, and well-armed, and it was available in large numbers. The Mustang began escorting bombers in late 1943 and early 1944, and the impact was immediate and dramatic. German fighters that had previously been able to attack bombers with relative freedom now had to fight through screens of American fighters. The Luftwaffe, which had been inflicting terrible losses on American bombers, now began suffering terrible losses itself. Other American fighters also contributed. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a massive and heavily armed fighter, could carry long-range tanks and provided excellent protection. The P-38 Lightning, with its distinctive twin-boom design, was added to the escort force. With fighter protection, daylight bombing became sustainable. American losses dropped significantly, while German losses mounted. The Luftwaffe was fighting a losing war of attrition. They were losing experienced pilots faster than they could train replacements. They were losing aircraft faster than factories could replace them, especially as those same factories were being bombed. By early 1944, the Americans had achieved something remarkable. They had made daylight strategic bombing work, something the British had concluded was impossible. With the Americans successfully bombing by day and the British continuing to bomb by night, the Allies had created what they called the round-the-clock bombing campaign. Germany's war industry got no respite. During the day, American bombers struck specific industrial targets. At night, British bombers attacked cities and industrial areas. This combined offensive was officially coordinated at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, where Allied leaders agreed on the strategic bombing campaign's objectives and how American and British efforts would complement each other. The directive called for the progressive destruction and dislocation of the German military, industrial and economic system, and the undermining of the morale of the German people to a point where their capacity for armed resistance is fatally weakened. The two approaches, American precision bombing by day and British area bombing by night, were in some ways complementary. American raids struck specific bottlenecks in German industry, while British raids disrupted the broader industrial base and drew German resources into civil defense and reconstruction. The differences in approach also reflected differences in equipment and doctrine. American bombers like the B-17 and B-24 were designed and optimized for daylight operations at high altitude. They had sophisticated bombsights and were equipped with oxygen systems and heated flight suits for the extreme cold of high-altitude flight. British bombers like the Lancaster were designed to carry maximum bomb loads to cities at night. They lacked the heavy defensive armament of American bombers but could carry much larger bombs. The crews also had different training and different perspectives. American crews trained extensively in formation flying and precision bombing. British crews trained in night navigation and operation. American crews often felt they were conducting a more surgical campaign targeting legitimate military objectives. British crews knew they were attacking cities but believed they were shortening the war and saving lives in the long run by crippling Germany's ability to fight. The strategic bombing campaign was extraordinarily costly for all sides. For the British, Bomber Command suffered the highest casualty rate of any British service during World War II. Of about 125,000 men who served in Bomber Command, more than 55,000 were killed, a loss rate of over 44%. Another 8,400 were wounded and nearly 10,000 became prisoners of war. These were volunteers, many of them young men barely out of their teens, flying night after night into heavily defended German airspace. For the Americans, the 8th Air Force, which bore the brunt of the bombing campaign against Germany, suffered approximately 26,000 killed and another 28,000 taken prisoner, out of a total force of about 350,000 men who served in it at various times. The odds of a bomber crewman completing a tour of duty, initially 25 missions, later increased to 35, without being killed, wounded, or captured were disturbingly low, especially in 1943 and early 1944. These statistics are abstractions of human tragedy. Every number represents a young man who died in terrible circumstances, trapped in a burning aircraft, killed instantly by flak or fighter cannon, suffocating in the thin air at high altitude, freezing in the extreme cold, or dying in crashes. Some fell through the sky in damaged bombers that broke apart. Others parachuted into enemy territory to spend the rest of the war in prison camps. Some managed miraculous escapes, finding their way back to friendly lines through occupied Europe. The psychological toll was immense. Bomber crews faced a unique kind of stress. The knowledge that every mission might be their last, the sight of other aircraft exploding or falling in flames, the responsibility for dropping bombs that killed people below, and the repeated exposure to combat over extended tours of duty. Cases of combat fatigue, what today we'd call PTSD, were common. For Germans on the ground, the bombing campaign was a nightmare. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 350,000 and 600,000 German civilians were killed by Allied bombing. Millions were made homeless. Major cities were reduced to rubble. The firestorms in Hamburg and Dresden became symbols of the bombing war's horror. Survivors described apocalyptic scenes of entire neighborhoods burning, people suffocating in bomb shelters as fires consumed all the oxygen, and streets so hot from flames that asphalt melted. The question of whether strategic bombing worked, whether it justified its cost and accomplished its objectives, remains controversial among historians. On one hand, the bombing campaign unquestionably damaged Germany's war effort. Oil production was severely disrupted by American attacks on refineries and synthetic fuel plants, directly affecting the mobility of German forces. Transportation networks were shattered, making it difficult to move supplies and troops. Aircraft production was dispersed and disrupted, and the need to defend against bombers forced Germany to divert enormous resources. Fighters, anti-aircraft guns, ammunition, and hundreds of thousands of personnel from other uses. The Luftwaffe was ground down through attrition, leaving German forces on all fronts without adequate air support. German Armaments Minister Albert Speer, in his post-war writings, acknowledged that the bombing campaign, particularly the attacks on oil production and transportation, severely hampered Germany's ability to wage war, especially in the final year of the conflict. On the other hand, German war production actually increased until late 1944, despite the bombing. German industry proved remarkably resilient, dispersing factories, using underground facilities, repairing damage quickly, and finding workarounds for destroyed facilities. The bombing campaign absorbed enormous Allied resources and cost tens of thousands of Allied airmen's lives. Some historians argue those resources could have been better used elsewhere, such as building more landing craft for amphibious operations or providing more tactical air support for ground forces. The area bombing of cities remains particularly controversial. Critics argue it was largely ineffective at crippling German industry, that it diverted resources from more effective precision bombing, and that it was morally questionable or outright wrong to deliberately target civilian populations. Defenders argue it tied down enormous German resources in civil defense, disrupted war production indirectly, damaged German morale, and was a justifiable response to German aggression and atrocities. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. The bombing campaign was not the war-winning weapon that its early advocates had predicted. It did not, by itself, bring Germany to its knees. But it was a significant component of Allied victory, contributing to the defeat of Germany alongside ground campaigns, naval warfare, and economic pressure. Whether it was worth its enormous cost in lives and resources remains a question each person must answer based on their own values and understanding of history. The story of why the Americans bombed by day and the British by night is ultimately a story about adaptation, doctrine, technology, and human cost. The British learned through devastating early experience that their bombers couldn't survive daylight operations against German defenses. They adapted by shifting to night operations, accepting the limitation that night bombing couldn't hit precision targets, and changing their entire strategy to focus on area attacks against cities. The Americans came later to the war with better bombers, better defensive firepower, and confidence in precision bombing. They persisted with daylight operations despite terrible losses, and eventually solved the problem of bomber vulnerability by developing long-range fighter escorts that could protect the bombers throughout their missions. Neither approach was perfect. Both cost enormous numbers of lives, both of Allied airmen and of German civilians. Both contributed to the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany, though historians still debate exactly how much each contributed and whether the price was justified. What's clear is that the strategic bombing campaign of World War II represented one of the largest, most sustained, and most costly military operations in history. It involved remarkable technological innovation, extraordinary courage by air crews on both sides, massive industrial production, and terrible human suffering. The decision to bomb by day or by night wasn't just a tactical choice. It reflected different national experiences, different technologies, different doctrines, and different conclusions drawn from the same brutal reality of modern warfare. The partnership between American daylight precision bombing and British nighttime area bombing created the round-the-clock offensive that gave Germany no respite. Two different approaches, born from different circumstances and philosophies, ultimately worked together toward the same goal: the defeat of Nazi Germany and the end of World War II in Europe.